The crack of thunder split the sky above the Wyoming Territory mountains, and Nora Langford's hands trembled so violently that she dropped the water bucket she had been carrying from the creek. She was 22 years old, a grown woman who had traveled alone from St. Louis to the frontier settlement of Salida in 1877, yet the sound of thunder still turned her into a frightened child. Her breath came in short gasps as she pressed her back against the rough wooden wall of the boarding house where she worked, squeezing her eyes shut and covering her ears with trembling fingers. The storm was building quickly over the mountains, dark clouds rolling across the peaks like angry fists, and she knew she would not make it inside before the worst of it hit. She had been terrified of thunder since she was small, since the day a lightning strike had killed her father in the fields outside their Missouri farm when she was only 6 years old. Her mother had tried everything to help her overcome the fear, but nothing had worked. The sound of thunder transported her back to that afternoon, to her mother's screams, to the smell of smoke and burned earth, to her father lying still in the churned mud. Even now, 16 years later, every rumble made her heart race and her stomach clench with that same childhood terror. Another crack of thunder boomed across the valley, closer this time, and Nora whimpered despite herself. She was alone on this side of the boarding house, having come to fetch water for the evening meal preparation. The other women were inside, too far away to hear her over the approaching storm. Rain began to fall in heavy drops, cold against her skin, soaking through her plain cotton dress within moments. She should run inside, she knew that, but her legs would not obey her mind. They felt frozen, rooted to the ground by the same paralysis that always gripped her during storms. Then she heard footsteps, heavy and purposeful, approaching through the rain. She forced her eyes open and saw him coming toward her through the downpour, a man so large and solid that he seemed like a piece of the mountain itself made flesh. She had seen him before in town, always from a distance. The other women at the boarding house whispered about him with a mixture of fear and fascination. They called him Kieran Knox, the mountain man who lived somewhere up in the high country, who came down to Salida only occasionally for supplies. He was a solitary figure, tall and powerfully built, with long dark hair that fell past his shoulders and a thick beard that could not hide the strong line of his jaw. He wore buckskin clothing that molded to his muscular frame, and his arms were bare despite the cold rain, showing the corded strength in his shoulders and forearms. His eyes were a startling blue against his tanned skin, and they were fixed on her with an intensity that should have frightened her, but somehow did not. He moved with surprising grace for such a large man, crossing the muddy ground between them in a few long strides. "You are afraid," he said. His voice was deep and rough, like gravel rolling down a mountainside, but there was something gentle in it that made her throat tighten with unexpected emotion. Thunder crashed again, so loud it seemed to shake the ground, and Nora could not stop the cry that escaped her lips. Her hands flew back to cover her ears, and her whole body shook with terror. She could not think, could not breathe, could only feel the overwhelming panic that consumed her whenever a storm came. Without a word, Kieran closed the distance between them and pulled her against his chest. His arms came around her, solid and warm despite the cold rain, creating a wall of protection between her and the storm. One of his large hands cradled the back of her head, pressing her face against his shoulder, while the other arm wrapped around her back, holding her steady. He was so much bigger than her that she felt completely enveloped by him, surrounded by his strength and his warmth. "I have you," he said quietly, his voice rumbling through his chest against her ear. "You are safe." She knew she should pull away, that it was improper for an unmarried woman to be held this way by a man she did not know, but she could not make herself move. His presence anchored her, kept her from drowning in the waves of panic. The thunder continued to roll across the sky, but with her face pressed against his shoulder and his arms around her, the sound became muffled, less immediate. She could feel his heartbeat, steady and strong, and she tried to match her breathing to its rhythm. The storm raged around them for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Kieran did not move, did not speak again, just held her with that same steady strength until the worst of the thunder had passed and rolled on toward the eastern plains. The rain continued to fall, soaking them both through, but Nora barely noticed. All she could focus on was the feeling of safety, of being protected, that came from being held in this stranger's arms. When the thunder finally faded to a distant rumble, Kieran loosened his hold slightly, but he did not let her go. Instead, he looked down at her, water streaming down his face and dripping from his beard, his blue eyes searching hers with a gentleness that seemed at odds with his rugged appearance. "Are you well now?" he asked. Nora nodded, not trusting her voice. Now that the immediate terror had passed, she became acutely aware of how close they were, of the solid warmth of his body against hers, of the way his arms still held her as if she were something precious. She should step back, should thank him and hurry inside before anyone saw them, but she found herself reluctant to leave the safety of his embrace. "I am sorry," she finally managed to say, her voice shaky. "I do not know what you must think of me. I am not usually so foolish." "There is no foolishness in fear," Kieran said, "and there is strength in allowing yourself to be helped." He released her then, stepping back to give her space, and Nora immediately felt the loss of his warmth. The rain was already beginning to lighten, the clouds breaking apart to reveal patches of evening sky. She wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold without his body heat to shield her. "Thank you," she said, looking up at him. "I have been afraid of storms since I was a child. Since my father was killed by lightning. I know it is unreasonable, but I cannot seem to control it." Something shifted in Kieran's expression, a softening around his eyes that made him look less intimidating and more human. "Some fears cannot be reasoned away," he said. "They must simply be endured, but they are easier to endure when you do not face them alone." Before Nora could respond, the back door of the boarding house opened and Mrs. Morrison, the owner, stepped out onto the porch. She was a stern woman in her 50s, with iron-gray hair and a no-nonsense manner that intimidated most people who crossed her path. Her eyes widened when she saw Nora standing in the rain with Kieran Knox, both of them soaked through and standing far too close for propriety. "Miss Langford," she called sharply. "What is the meaning of this? Get inside at once." Nora felt her face flush with embarrassment. She gathered her skirts and hurried toward the porch, leaving the fallen water bucket where it lay in the mud. As she passed Kieran, she glanced back at him one more time. He was watching her go, his expression unreadable, rain still streaming down his face. Then she was inside, and Mrs. Morrison was closing the door firmly behind them, blocking Kieran from view. "I do not know what you were thinking, standing out in the rain with that man, Mrs. Morrison said, her tone severe. "Kieran Knox is not the sort of person a respectable young woman should be seen with. He lives up in those mountains like a savage, rarely comes to town, and when he does, he keeps to himself. There are rumors about him, about why he left civilization behind." "He was helping me," Nora said quietly, wringing water from her hair. "The storm frightened me, and he made sure I was safe. That is all." Mrs. Morrison's expression softened slightly. She knew about Nora's fear of storms, had witnessed several episodes since Nora had arrived in Salida 3 months earlier. "Even so," she said. "You must be more careful. Your reputation is all you have in a place like this. Now go change into dry clothes before you catch your death." Nora nodded and hurried up the stairs to the small room she shared with two other women who worked at the boarding house. Thankfully, both of them were busy downstairs helping with dinner preparations, so she had the room to herself. She peeled off her wet dress and undergarments, shivering in the cool air, and dried herself with a rough towel before pulling on her only other dress, a faded blue cotton that had seen better days. As she dressed, she could not stop thinking about Kieran Knox, about the way he had held her through the storm without hesitation or judgment, about the gentleness in his rough voice when he had spoken to her. She wondered what rumors Mrs. Morrison had been referring to, what might have driven such a man to leave civilization behind and live alone in the mountains. There had been something in his eyes, a depth of understanding, that suggested he knew what it was like to carry scars from the past. Over the next several days, Nora found herself looking for Kieran whenever she went into town on errands for the boarding house. Salida was a small settlement, just a handful of buildings clustered in a valley surrounded by towering mountains. There was a general store, a saloon, a church, and a few other establishments that served the ranchers and prospectors who worked the surrounding area. But Kieran was nowhere to be seen, and she began to wonder if he had already returned to his mountain home. Life at the boarding house fell back into its usual rhythm. Nora spent her days cooking, cleaning, washing linens, and serving meals to the various men who paid for room and board while they worked in the mines or on nearby ranches. It was hard work, and the pay was meager, but it was honest employment and better than the alternatives available to a young, unmarried woman on the frontier. She had come to Wyoming territory hoping to make a fresh start after her mother's death had left her alone in St. Louis with no family and no prospects. The journey had been long and difficult, but she had made it, and she was determined to build a life for herself here. A week after the storm, Nora was hanging laundry on the line behind the boarding house when she heard the sound of a wagon approaching. She looked up to see Kieran driving a sturdy buckboard down the muddy road, his long hair tied back with a leather cord, his powerful frame commanding even while seated. He pulled the wagon to a stop near the boarding house and climbed down with easy grace despite his size. Nora's heart began to race, though not from fear this time. She set down the wet sheet she had been about to hang and wiped her damp hands on her apron, suddenly very aware of how she must look with her hair coming loose from its pins, and her dress stained with soap and water. Kieran walked toward her with that same purposeful stride she remembered from the storm. He carried a leather satchel in one hand, and as he drew closer, she could see that his eyes were fixed on her with the same intensity as before. "Miss Langford," he said, stopping a respectful distance away. "I hope I am not disturbing your work." "No," Nora said quickly, feeling flustered. "I mean, you are not disturbing me. Is there something I can help you with, Mr. Knox?" "I brought you something," he said. He opened the satchel and pulled out a small bundle wrapped in soft leather. "I thought it might help, with the storms." Nora took the bundle, her fingers brushing against his as she did so, and felt a strange flutter in her chest at the contact. She unwrapped the leather to reveal two small objects carved from wood. They were beautifully made, smooth and warm to the touch. One was a small horse, captured in mid-gallop with incredible detail despite being no larger than her palm. The other was a bird with its wings spread wide, every feather carefully rendered. "They are beautiful," she whispered, looking up at him in wonder. "Did you make these?" Kieran nodded. "Carving helps me think. I have been making such things for years. I thought perhaps if you held something solid in your hands during a storm, something to focus on, it might help ground you. make the fear more manageable. Tears pricked at Nora's eyes, and she had to blink them back. She could not remember the last time anyone had done something so thoughtful for her, had taken the time to think about her needs and try to help. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "This is incredibly kind." "It is nothing," Kieran said, but she could see a faint color rising in his cheeks beneath his beard, as if her gratitude embarrassed him. "I only hope it helps." They stood there for a moment in silence, and Nora found herself studying his face, noticing details she had missed during the storm. There were small scars scattered across his skin, the marks of a hard life lived outdoors. His nose had been broken at least once, giving it a slight crook. But his eyes were kind, and his mouth, what she could see of it beneath his beard, had a gentle curve to it that softened his rugged features. "The other women at the boarding house say you live up in the mountains," Nora said, surprising herself with her boldness. "That must be a lonely life." "It is quiet," Kieran said. "I prefer it that way. There are fewer complications in the mountains, fewer disappointments." "But do you not miss having someone to talk to, someone to share things with?" Kieran's expression became guarded, and Nora immediately regretted her question. "I am sorry," she said quickly. "I did not mean to pry. It is none of my business." "I had a family once," Kieran said quietly, and the pain in his voice made Nora's heart ache. "A wife and a daughter. We lived in Colorado, near Denver. I worked as a carpenter, built furniture and houses. We were happy." He paused, his jaw tightening. "There was an outbreak of scarlet fever 6 years ago. They both died within days of each other. I buried them on a hillside overlooking the valley where we had planned to build our house." "Oh, Kieran," Nora breathed, using his first name without thinking. "I am so sorry." "After they were gone, I could not stay in that place anymore," he continued. "Every street, every building reminded me of what I had lost. So I sold everything, bought supplies, and went into the mountains. I have been there ever since." He looked at her directly, and the raw honesty in his eyes made her breath catch. "You asked if I miss having someone to talk to. The answer is yes. I miss it every day. But missing something and having the courage to reach for it again are two different things." Nora understood that sentiment all too well. She had been so focused on survival since her mother's death, on simply making it through each day, that she had not allowed herself to think about what else she might want from life. But standing here with Kieran, holding the beautiful carvings he had made for her, she felt something stirring inside her that had been dormant for a long time. Hope, perhaps, or possibility. "I think you just showed courage by coming here today," Nora said softly. "By reaching out to help someone you barely know." Kieran's expression shifted, surprise flickering across his features before being replaced by something warmer. "Perhaps," he said. "Or perhaps I just could not stand the thought of you facing another storm alone and afraid." Before Nora could respond, Mrs. Morrison's voice called from the back door of the boarding house. "Miss Langford, those sheets will not hang themselves, and supper will not cook itself either," Nora sighed. "I have to get back to work," she said reluctantly, "but thank you again for these." She held up the carvings. "They mean more to me than you know." Kieran nodded and turned to go back to his wagon, but before he climbed up onto the seat, he looked back at her one more time. "If there is another storm," he said, "and you need someone, I am staying at the livery stable while I conduct some business in town. I will be here for a few more days." Then he was gone, driving the wagon back toward the center of town, leaving Nora standing by the laundry line with her heart beating faster than it should, and her mind full of questions she had no answers for. She clutched the wooden carvings in her hand, feeling their solid weight, and wondered if Kieran Knox realized what he had given her. Not just a tool to manage her fear, but a connection, a lifeline to another person who understood what it was like to carry old wounds. That night, as Nora lay in her narrow bed listening to her roommates snore softly, she held the little wooden horse and bird in her hands, running her fingers over their smooth surfaces. She thought about Kieran's wife and daughter, about the life he had lost, and her heart ached for him. She understood now why he had retreated to the mountains, why he had chosen solitude over trying to rebuild among people and places that would constantly remind him of his grief. But she also thought about the way he had held her during the storm, the way he had come back to check on her, to bring her something that might help. Those were not the actions of a man who had completely given up on human connection. They were the actions of someone who still had love to give, who still had the capacity to care, even if he had convinced himself otherwise. 3 days later, another storm rolled in from the west. Nora was in the kitchen when she heard the first rumble of thunder, and her hands immediately began to shake. She was cutting vegetables for stew, and she nearly sliced her finger as the knife slipped from her trembling grip. Her breathing became shallow, and the familiar panic began to rise in her chest like a flood of icy water. She set down the knife and pulled the wooden carvings from her apron pocket, where she had taken to keeping them at all times. She closed her hands around them, feeling their warmth and weight, and tried to focus on their solid reality instead of the approaching storm. It helped, but not enough. Thunder crashed again, closer now, and she whimpered despite her best efforts to remain calm. "Nora, what is wrong?" asked Sarah, one of the other women who worked in the kitchen. She was a few years older than Nora, with red hair and a kind face. "Storm," Nora managed to say through chattering teeth. "I need to go outside." "Outside in this weather? Are you mad?" But Nora was already moving toward the back door, drawn by an instinct she did not fully understand. She needed air, needed space, needed to get away from the close walls of the kitchen that suddenly felt like they were pressing in on her. She burst through the door and onto the back porch, just as the rain began to fall in heavy sheets. And there he was, Kieran, striding through the downpour toward the boarding house as if he had known she would need him. His long hair was already soaked, plastered to his head and shoulders, and his blue eyes were locked on her with that same intensity that made her feel seen in a way she had never experienced before. He climbed the steps to the porch and pulled her into his arms without a word, just as he had done before. She went willingly, pressing her face against his chest and breathing in the scent of rain and pine and something else that was uniquely him. His arms came around her, strong and protective, and she felt the panic begin to recede like a tide going out. "How did you know?" she asked, her voice muffled against his shirt. "I saw the storm coming," he said simply. "I knew you would be afraid." They stood like that for a long time, while the thunder rolled overhead and the rain drummed against the porch roof. Kieran's hand moved in slow, soothing circles on her back, and he murmured quiet words of comfort that she could barely hear over the storm, but that calmed her nonetheless. She could feel the steady beat of his heart beneath her cheek, could feel the rise and fall of his chest with each breath, and she let those rhythms anchor her to the present moment. When the worst of the thunder had passed, Nora finally pulled back enough to look up at him. Water dripped from his beard onto her upturned face, and she saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch. It was not just kindness or sympathy. It was deeper than that, more complicated, tinged with the same longing she had heard in his voice when he had spoken about missing human connection. "You keep saving me," she said softly. "You keep needing saving," he replied, but there was no judgment in his words, only a gentle teasing that made her smile despite herself. "I used the carvings," she told him. "They helped, but I still needed you more." Kieran's hand came up to cup her face, his calloused palm rough but gentle against her cheek. "Nora," he said, and the way he spoke her name sent shivers through her that had nothing to do with the cold rain. "I should not have come here. I should not be holding you like this. It is not proper, and people will talk." "I do not care what people say," Nora said, surprised by her own boldness. "You have shown me more kindness in the past few weeks than anyone else has in years. You have helped me without asking for anything in return." "Why should I care what people think about that?" "Because you have to live in this town," Kieran said. "You have to work here, build a life here. I am just a mountain man who will go back to his solitude when my business is finished. I cannot offer you anything beyond these moments." "I am not asking you to offer me anything," Nora said, though even as she spoke the words, she knew they were not entirely true. She was asking for something, even if she could not quite name it yet. She was asking for him to see her, to care about her, to not disappear from her life now that he had become such an important part of it. Kieran's thumb brushed across her cheekbone, wiping away a raindrop or perhaps a tear. "You should ask for more," he said quietly. "You deserve more than a broken man who has forgotten how to live among people." "You do not seem broken to me," Nora said. "You seem like someone who has survived terrible loss and is doing the best he can, just like me." Something in Kieran's expression cracked then, a vulnerability showing through that she sensed he rarely let anyone see. "I do not want to hurt you," he said. "I do not think I could bear it if I caused you pain." "Then do not hurt me," Nora said simply. "Stay, get to know me. Let me get to know you. We do not have to decide anything beyond that right now." She could see him struggling with himself, could see the war between what he wanted and what he thought he should do playing out across his features. Finally, he nodded slowly. "I will stay," he said. "For a while longer. Until the next storm, at least." Nora smiled, feeling a warmth bloom in her chest that had nothing to do with being sheltered from the rain. "Until the next storm," she agreed. Over the following weeks, Kieran became a regular presence in Salida. He had originally planned to stay only a few days while he sold some furs and bought supplies, but he found reasons to extend his visit. He took odd jobs around town, using his carpentry skills to repair buildings and make furniture. The work was not difficult for him, and it gave him an excuse to remain near the boarding house near Nora. They fell into a pattern. Whenever Nora had free time, which was not often given the demanding nature of her work, she would find Kieran wherever he was working, and they would talk. At first, their conversations were cautious, both of them dancing around deeper topics, learning the surface details of each other's lives. But gradually, as trust built between them, they began to share more. Nora told him about growing up in Missouri, about her father's death, and how it had shattered something fundamental in her sense of safety. She told him about her mother, who had worked herself to exhaustion trying to keep their small farm running after her husband died, only to succumb to pneumonia the previous winter. She told him about the loneliness of being truly alone in the world, with no family to turn to and no place that felt like home. Kieran, in turn, told her more about his life before the mountains. He described his wife, Emily, who had been small and fierce and full of laughter. He talked about his daughter, Clara, who had been 4 years old when she died, with her mother's dark curls and her father's blue eyes. He spoke of the carpentry work he had loved, the satisfaction of creating beautiful things with his hands, the pride he had felt in building a good life for his family. "I have not made anything truly beautiful since they died," he admitted one afternoon as they sat together on the bank of a creek that ran through town. "The carvings I do are just to pass the time, to keep my hands busy. But they are not the same as the furniture I used to make, the pieces I would spend weeks perfecting." "Why not?" Nora asked, genuinely curious. Kieran was quiet for a long moment, watching the water flow past. "Because making something beautiful requires hope," he finally said. "It requires believing that there is a future worth creating for, that there will be people to appreciate what you have made. After Emily and Clara died, I lost that belief. I stopped seeing the point in creating anything beyond what was necessary for survival." "And now?" Nora asked softly. Kieran turned to look at her, and the expression in his eyes made her heart race. "Now I am beginning to remember what it felt like to have hope," he said. "You are teaching me that, whether you realize it or not." Their relationship deepened with each passing day, each shared conversation, each moment spent in each other's company. Kieran showed Nora how to identify different plants that grew in the mountains, which ones were edible and which ones had medicinal properties. He taught her how to read the sky for signs of incoming weather, how to move quietly through the forest, how to find her way using the position of the sun and the stars. Nora, in turn, reminded Kieran what it was like to laugh, to enjoy simple pleasures, to feel connected to another human being. The people of Salida noticed, of course. It was impossible to keep anything private in such a small community. Mrs. Morrison continued to disapprove, warning Nora that she was risking her reputation by spending so much time with Kieran. The other women at the boarding house were divided in their opinions. Some thought it was romantic, a lonely woman finding love with a mysterious mountain man. Others thought Nora was being foolish, throwing away her respectability for a man who would inevitably break her heart and return to his solitary life. Nora tried not to let the gossip bother her, but she could not completely ignore it. She knew that her position at the boarding house was precarious. Mrs. Morrison could dismiss her at any time if she decided that Nora's behavior was bringing disrepute to the establishment. And if that happened, Nora had nowhere else to go, no other prospects in this small frontier town. But every time she considered pulling away from Kieran, every time she thought about ending their growing connection to protect herself, another storm would roll in, and he would be there. He never failed to appear when thunder began to rumble, never failed to hold her and keep her safe until the storm passed. And each time he held her, the feelings between them grew stronger, more impossible to deny. One evening in late summer, after a particularly violent thunderstorm had torn through the valley, Kieran held Nora on the front porch of the boarding house while lightning split the sky in brilliant forks. She was trembling in his arms, her face pressed against his chest, when she felt his lips brush against the top of her head in a gesture so tender it made her want to weep. "Kieran," she whispered when the thunder had finally faded to a distant growl. "Yes, I think I am falling in love with you." She felt him go very still, his arms tightening around her. For a long moment he said nothing, and fear clutched at her heart. Perhaps she had misread the situation. Perhaps he did not feel the same way. Perhaps she had just made a terrible mistake. But then he pulled back enough to look down at her, and the expression on his face was so full of emotion that it took her breath away. "Nora," he said, his voice rough, "I have already fallen. I think I started falling the first time I saw you, terrified and alone in the rain, trying so hard to be brave despite your fear." He cupped her face in both of his large hands, tilting her head up to meet his gaze. "I love you," he said, the words sounding like a vow. "I did not think I would ever say those words to another woman. I did not think I had it in me anymore, but you have brought something back to life in me that I thought was dead and buried with my family." Tears streamed down Nora's face, but they were tears of joy, not sorrow. "I love you too," she said again, needing him to hear it, to understand the depth of what she felt. Then Kieran was kissing her, his lips finding hers with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with his rugged appearance. The kiss was slow and sweet, full of promise and hope and the tentative beginning of something new. Nora's arms came up to wrap around his neck, her fingers threading through his long hair, and she kissed him back with all the emotion she had been holding inside. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Kieran rested his forehead against hers. "What do we do now?" he asked. "I do not know," Nora admitted. "But I know I do not want to lose you. I cannot go back to how things were before you came into my life." "You will not have to," Kieran said firmly. "I am not going anywhere, not without you." The next few weeks were both wonderful and complicated. Kieran made it clear to everyone in Salida that his intentions toward Nora were honorable. He spoke to Mrs. Morrison directly, assuring her that he was courting Nora properly, and that he intended to marry her if she would have him. Mrs. Morrison remained skeptical, questioning whether a mountain man could truly provide for a wife, whether he could give Nora the kind of stable life she deserved. Kieran's answer was to show rather than tell. He took on more work in town, saving every penny he earned. He began making plans to build a proper cabin on his land in the mountains, something larger and more comfortable than the small shelter he had been living in. He talked about starting a carpentry business, perhaps in Salida or in one of the larger towns nearby, using his skills to create a stable income. "I know I cannot give you the life you might have had in a city," he told Nora one evening as they walked together through town. "But I can give you a good life, a safe life. I can build us a home that will shelter us from any storm. And I promise you, Nora, I will spend every day for the rest of my life making sure you never regret choosing me." "I could never regret choosing you," Nora said, squeezing his hand. "You are the best thing that has ever happened to me." As autumn approached, painting the mountains in brilliant shades of gold and red, Kieran asked Nora to marry him. He did it simply, without grand gestures or elaborate speeches. They were sitting by the creek, watching the sun set behind the peaks, when he pulled a small wooden box from his pocket and opened it to reveal a ring. It was not a traditional ring with a diamond or gemstone. Instead, Kieran had carved it himself from a piece of dark wood, inlaying it with small pieces of turquoise he had found in the mountains. The craftsmanship was exquisite, every detail perfect, and Nora knew immediately that he had poured hours of work and love into creating it. "Nora Langford," he said, his deep voice steady despite the emotion she could see in his eyes. "Will you marry me? Will you let me spend the rest of my life holding you through every storm that comes?" "Yes," Nora said, her voice breaking with happiness. "Yes, Kieran, I will marry you." He slipped the ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly, as if it had been made specifically for her, which of course it had. Then he kissed her again, and Nora felt as if her heart might burst with the sheer joy of it all. They were married in the small church in Salida on a crisp October day in 1877. The ceremony was simple, attended by Mrs. Morrison and the other women from the boarding house, along with a handful of townspeople who had come to appreciate Kieran's quiet strength and honest work over the summer. Nora wore a dress that Sarah had helped her sew from cream-colored cotton, with lace trim that one of the other women had contributed. Kieran wore new clothes he had bought specially for the occasion, though he had kept his long hair and beard, and Nora would not have wanted him any other way. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Kieran kissed her with a tenderness that made several of the women in attendance dab at their eyes with handkerchiefs. Nora felt as if she were floating, as if the happiness bubbling up inside her might actually lift her off the ground. She had come to Wyoming territory alone and frightened, with nothing but a small trunk of belongings and a desperate hope for a better life. Now she had a husband who loved her, who understood her, who would protect her through any storm. After the ceremony, there was a small celebration at the boarding house. Mrs. Morrison had unbent enough to prepare a special meal, and there was even a cake, which was a rare luxury on the frontier. Nora felt overwhelmed by the generosity, by the way the community had come together to celebrate their marriage despite initial doubts about their relationship. As evening approached, Kieran and Nora prepared to leave for the cabin he had been building in the mountains. He had worked tirelessly over the past months to make it ready, and though Nora had not yet seen it, he had described it to her in detail. It sat in a valley high in the mountains, surrounded by pine trees, with a creek running nearby and views of the peaks in every direction. It was remote, certainly, but Kieran had assured her that they would not be completely isolated. The ride to Salida would take only a few hours, and they could come to town regularly for supplies and to maintain their connections with the community. As they rode out of town in Kieran's wagon, Nora looked back at Salida one last time. She felt a pang of nervousness about leaving behind the familiar, even though the boarding house had never truly felt like home. But when she looked at Kieran, sitting beside her with the reins in his capable hands, the nervousness faded. Wherever they were going, she would be with him, and that was enough. The ride into the mountains took several hours, following narrow trails that wound through thick forest and across rocky streams. The sun was setting by the time they reached the valley where Kieran had built their home, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. And then Nora saw the cabin, and her breath caught in her throat. It was beautiful, not grand or elaborate, but perfect in its simplicity. Kieran had built it from logs he had cut and shaped himself, fitting them together with the skill of a master craftsman. The cabin was larger than she had expected, with a stone chimney rising from one end and real glass windows that must have cost a fortune to transport up here. There was a porch across the front, with 2 rocking chairs already in place, positioned to face the sunset view. "Kieran," she breathed. "It is perfect." He helped her down from the wagon, his hands spanning her waist, and she could see the pride and relief in his eyes. "I wanted it to be right for you," he said. "I wanted you to have a real home, not just a shelter." He carried her across the threshold, as tradition demanded, and Nora looked around the interior with wonder. There was a main room with a fireplace already laid with wood, ready to be lit. Kieran had made furniture, beautiful pieces that showed his skill as a carpenter. There was a table with chairs, a cupboard for dishes and food, a comfortable-looking sofa. Through an open doorway, she could see a bedroom with a large bed covered in colorful quilts. "The bed is new," Kieran said, following her gaze. "I have been working on it for months, wanting it to be special." The quilts were a gift from some of the women in town. They said every new bride needs quilts. Nora turned to face him, tears streaming down her face again, though she was smiling. "I cannot believe you did all this," she said. "I cannot believe how lucky I am." "I am the lucky one," Kieran said, pulling her into his arms. "You gave me a reason to build again, to create something beautiful. You gave me a reason to hope for the future." That night, they made love for the first time, and Nora discovered that Kieran's gentleness extended to every aspect of their relationship. He was patient and tender, taking his time to make sure she felt safe and loved. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the big bed, Nora's head resting on Kieran's chest, listening to his heartbeat, and she felt a sense of peace she had never known before. "Are you happy?" Kieran asked softly, his fingers trailing through her hair. "Happier than I knew it was possible to be," Nora answered honestly. Their first months of marriage were an adjustment, but a mostly happy one. Nora had to learn how to manage a household in the wilderness, how to cook over the fireplace, how to preserve food for the winter, how to handle the isolation of living so far from other people. But Kieran was patient, teaching her everything she needed to know, and they worked together to make their cabin into a true home. The storms continued to come, of course. Thunder still sent terror racing through Nora's veins, still made her hands shake and her breath come short. But now, whenever she heard the first rumble, Kieran was there. He would drop whatever he was doing and gather her into his arms, holding her close until the storm passed. Sometimes he would take her to bed and hold her there, safe and warm under the quilts. Sometimes they would sit together on the sofa by the fire, with Nora curled up against his side and his arms wrapped around her. And slowly, over time, the fear became a little less overwhelming because she knew she would never have to face it alone. Winter came to the mountains with heavy snow and bitter cold. There were days when they were completely snowed in, unable to leave the cabin, with nothing to do but keep the fire burning and keep each other warm. Nora learned to love those days, the enforced closeness, the sense of being in their own small world with nothing to intrude on their happiness. Kieran spent the long winter evenings carving, and Nora watched his skilled hands transform pieces of wood into beautiful objects. He made bowls and spoons for their kitchen, decorative pieces to hang on the walls, toys that he said would be for their children someday. That last comment made Nora's heart skip, though they had not yet talked seriously about having children. But she could see in Kieran's eyes when he mentioned it that he was thinking about the future, about building a family together, and that knowledge filled her with quiet joy. One evening in late January, a particularly fierce storm struck the valley. The thunder was so loud it seemed to shake the cabin walls, and lightning illuminated the windows in brilliant flashes. Nora was terrified, clinging to Kieran with her eyes squeezed shut and her whole body trembling. But something was different this time. As Kieran held her and murmured comfort, she realized that beneath the fear, there was something else. Trust, security, the absolute certainty that she was safe, that Kieran would protect her, that the storm could not truly hurt her as long as she was in his arms. "I love you," she said when the worst of the thunder had passed, her voice muffled against his chest. "I love you too," Kieran replied, kissing the top of her head. "Are you all right?" "Yes," Nora said, and realized it was true. She was all right, more than all right. "I think the fear is getting better, smaller, because of you." Kieran pulled back to look at her, his blue eyes searching hers in the firelight. "You are the bravest person I know," he said seriously. "Facing your fear again and again, even though it terrifies you, that takes real courage." "It is easier to be brave when I know you will be there to catch me if I fall," Nora said. "I will always be there," Kieran promised. "Always." Spring came eventually, as it always does, melting the snow and bringing new life to the mountain valley. Nora discovered she was pregnant in April, and the joy she and Kieran felt was tempered only slightly by Kieran's lingering fear. He had lost a wife and child before, and Nora knew that the idea of going through pregnancy and childbirth again frightened him, even though he tried to hide it. "I am not Emily," Nora said gently when she realized what he was feeling. "And this baby is not Clara. What happened before was a terrible tragedy, but it does not mean it will happen again." "I know," Kieran said, but she could see the worry in his eyes. "I know that in my head. But my heart is having a harder time believing it." "Then I will believe it for both of us," Nora said firmly. "I will be fine. The baby will be fine. We will be a family." Kieran pulled her close, holding her as if she were infinitely precious. "I cannot lose you," he said, his voice breaking. "I cannot go through that again." "You will not lose me," Nora promised, even though she knew that no one could truly promise such a thing. "I am strong and I have you to take care of me. We will get through this together." As Nora's pregnancy progressed, Kieran became almost comically protective. He insisted on doing all the heavy work around the cabin, would not let her lift anything heavier than a cooking pot, and worried constantly about her health. Nora found it both endearing and occasionally frustrating, but she understood where his fear came from, and she tried to be patient. They made trips to Salida more frequently during those months, so that Nora could see the doctor who served the area. The doctor, an older man named Dr. Harrison, assured them that Nora was healthy and that the pregnancy was progressing normally. Those visits helped ease some of Kieran's worry, though he never completely relaxed. Thunder still came with the spring and summer storms, but Nora's fear continued to diminish. She still felt anxious when storms approached, still needed Kieran's presence to feel truly safe, but the paralyzing terror that had once consumed her had lessened significantly. She attributed this partly to the carvings Kieran had made for her, which she still kept close at hand, but mostly to Kieran himself. His steady presence, his unwavering support, had taught her that she did not have to face her fears alone, and that knowledge had given her a strength she had not known she possessed. Their son was born on a clear November evening in 1878 with Dr. Harrison in attendance and 2 women from town who had come to help with the birth. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Nora saw genuine terror in Kieran's eyes as he held her hand and helped her through each contraction. But in the end, both mother and baby were healthy, and when Dr. Harrison placed the squalling infant in Kieran's arms, the look of wonder and relief on his face made Nora weep with joy. They named him Nathaniel, after Nora's father. He had Kieran's blue eyes and a surprising amount of dark hair for a newborn. Kieran held his son with a tenderness that was almost painful to witness, tears streaming down his face into his beard as he looked at the new life he and Nora had created together. "He is perfect," Kieran whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Nora, he is absolutely perfect." "We made him together," Nora said softly, exhausted but happier than she had ever been. "He is ours." Kieran carefully placed Nathaniel in Nora's arms and then wrapped his own arms around both of them, encircling his family in a protective embrace. "I never thought I would have this again," he said. "A wife, a child, a family. I thought that part of my life was over." "It was never over," Nora said. "It was just waiting for the right time to begin again." The first year of Nathaniel's life was exhausting and wonderful in equal measure. Nora had never been so tired in her life, but she had also never been so fulfilled. Watching Kieran with their son was a particular joy. He was a devoted father, patient and gentle, willing to wake in the night to help with feedings, and to spend hours walking the cabin floor with a fussy baby. When Nathaniel was 6 months old, a thunderstorm rolled through their valley in the middle of the afternoon. Nora heard the first rumble and felt the familiar tightening in her chest, but before she could react, Kieran was there, gathering both her and the baby into his arms. He held them on the sofa, his large body sheltering them both while the storm raged outside. "I have you both," he murmured. "You are both safe." And Nora realized something in that moment. She was not just less afraid because Kieran held her through the storms. She was less afraid because she had learned what it meant to be truly loved, to be protected, to be part of something larger than herself. The fear would probably never completely disappear, but it no longer controlled her life. She had faced it again and again with Kieran by her side, and each time she had survived, she had grown stronger. "Thank you," she said, looking up at Kieran. "For what?" he asked, genuinely puzzled. "For never giving up on me. For showing me that it is possible to be afraid and brave at the same time. For teaching me what it means to be loved." Kieran's eyes softened, and he kissed her gently, mindful of the baby sleeping in her arms. "You taught me those same things," he said. You showed me that it is possible to love again after loss, to build a new life without forgetting the old one. You saved me just as much as I saved you." As the years passed, their family grew. Nora gave birth to a daughter they named Catherine in 1880 and another son, James, in 1883. Their cabin in the mountains became a true home, filled with the sounds of children's laughter and the warmth of family life. Kieran's carpentry business flourished as his reputation spread throughout the territory. He made furniture for wealthy ranchers and merchants, beautiful pieces that commanded high prices and allowed them to live comfortably. But despite their growing success, Kieran and Nora never forgot the storms that had brought them together. Whenever thunder rumbled across the valley, no matter what else was happening, Kieran would stop what he was doing and find Nora. Sometimes he would pull her into his arms while the children played nearby, unconcerned by the weather. Sometimes he would take her to their bedroom for privacy, holding her close until the storm passed. And sometimes, as the children grew older and understood their mother's fear, the whole family would gather together on the sofa, with Kieran's strong arms around all of them, weathering the storm as a united front. Nora's fear of thunder never completely disappeared, though it continued to diminish over the years. But she stopped seeing it as a weakness. Instead, she came to view it as the thing that had led her to Kieran, the vulnerability that had allowed him to see who she really was and to show her who he was in return. Every storm became a reminder of how far they had come together, of the love they had built from shared pain and mutual understanding. On their 10th wedding anniversary in 1887, Kieran gave Nora a gift. It was a large wooden box, intricately carved with images of mountains and storms and a couple holding each other through the rain. Inside the box were dozens of small wooden carvings, each one representing a storm they had weathered together over the years. "I have been making one after every storm," Kieran explained as Nora examined the carvings with tears in her eyes, "as a reminder that we can face anything together." "It is beautiful," Nora whispered. "You are beautiful. Not just on the outside, but who you are, the man you have become again through loving me." "The man I have become again through letting myself be loved by you," Kieran corrected gently. That night, after the children were asleep, another storm rolled through the valley. Nora and Kieran stood together on their porch, his arms around her from behind, watching the lightning flash across the sky. Nora felt the old fear stirring, but it was muted now, manageable, almost familiar, like an old acquaintance rather than a terrifying enemy. "Are you all right?" Kieran asked, as he always did. "I am perfect," Nora answered honestly. "I am exactly where I am supposed to be." Thunder crashed overhead, loud enough to shake the ground, and Nora barely flinched. Because she knew, with the absolute certainty that comes from years of proof, that Kieran would hold her through this storm and every storm that came after. He had promised to be there always, and he had never broken that promise, not once in all their years together. As they stood there in the rain, holding each other while the thunder rolled and the lightning danced, Nora thought about the frightened young woman she had been when she first came to Salida. She thought about her terror of storms, about her loneliness, about her desperate hope for something better. And she marveled at how far she had come, at the life she had built with this strong, gentle man who had seen her at her most vulnerable and had loved her not despite her fear, but because of the courage it took to face it. The storm eventually passed, as storms always do, leaving the air clean and fresh and full of promise. Kieran and Nora went back inside their warm cabin, to their sleeping children and their comfortable life, and Nora felt nothing but gratitude for the thunder that had brought them together, and the love that had seen them through every storm since. 20 more years passed in their mountain valley, years filled with the joys and sorrows that make up any life. The children grew up strong and capable, learning carpentry from their father and resilience from their mother. Nathaniel became a skilled woodworker like Kieran, eventually building his own cabin on their land and starting his own family. Catherine, spirited and independent, became a teacher in Salida, commuting from the mountains to town and bringing education to the children of the growing settlement. James, the youngest, inherited his father's love of the wilderness and became a guide, leading hunters and explorers through the mountain passes. Kieran's hair turned gray, then white, though he remained strong and capable well into his 60s. Nora aged more gently, her dark hair streaking with silver, her face lined with years of laughter and love. They grew old together in the cabin Kieran had built, surrounded by grandchildren who filled the valley with new life and new hope. And through it all, whenever thunder rolled across the mountains, Kieran held Nora close. It became a sacred ritual for them, this holding through storms, a physical reminder of their love and commitment to each other. Their children and grandchildren grew up seeing this, understanding that true love meant being there for each other in moments of fear and vulnerability. That strength came not from the absence of fear, but from facing it together. On a summer evening in 1907, 30 years after they had first met in the rain, Kieran and Nora sat together on their porch, watching their grandchildren play in the meadow below the cabin. Dark clouds were gathering over the peaks, and Nora could feel a storm approaching. She was 72 now, and Kieran was 75, but the years had not diminished the love between them. If anything, it had grown stronger, deeper, more essential. "Storm coming," Kieran observed, his voice still deep despite his age. "I know," Nora said, reaching for his hand. "But I am not afraid." "No?" Kieran asked, looking at her with those same blue eyes that had first captivated her so many years ago. "Well, perhaps a little," Nora admitted with a smile. "Old fears die hard, but I have you, and that makes all the difference." Kieran squeezed her hand, his grip still strong despite the arthritis that had begun to stiffen his fingers. "I will always be here to hold you through the storms," he said, just as he had said countless times before. "I know," Nora said, leaning her head against his shoulder. "You have never broken that promise. Not once in 30 years. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and Kieran's arm came around Nora's shoulders, pulling her close. They sat like that as the storm approached, as comfortable in their silence as they were in conversation, as steady in their love as they had been from the beginning. The grandchildren ran for cover as the first drops of rain began to fall, but Kieran and Nora remained on the porch, holding each other as the thunder crashed overhead and the lightning split the sky. Nora still felt the flutter of fear in her chest when the thunder was particularly loud, but it was a small thing now, easily managed, easily overcome. She had spent 30 years learning that she could survive her fear, that she could face it again and again and come through to the other side. And she had learned it because of the man who held her, the man who had seen her at her weakest and had loved her all the more for it. As the storm passed and the evening light returned, painting everything in shades of gold and amber, Kieran kissed the top of Nora's head, a gesture as familiar and comforting as breathing. "I love you," he said. "I have loved you through every storm, and I will love you through every storm still to come." "And I love you," Nora replied, turning to look up at him. "Thank you for holding me. Thank you for never letting go." "Never," Kieran promised, and Nora knew he meant it. They remained on the porch long after the storm had passed, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors, holding each other as they had done for 3 decades, and would continue to do for whatever time they had left. The fear that had once controlled Nora's life had become just another thread in the tapestry of their shared existence, woven together with love and trust, and the deep knowledge that they would face whatever came together. In the end, that was what mattered most. Not that Nora had overcome her fear completely, but that she had learned she did not have to overcome it alone. Kieran had taught her that, had shown her through his actions what it meant to truly love someone, to be there for them in their moments of greatest vulnerability and need. And in return, Nora had taught Kieran that it was possible to love again after devastating loss, to build a new life without betraying the memory of what came before. They had saved each other, these two wounded souls who had found each other in a thunderstorm in a small Wyoming settlement. And they had built something beautiful together, something lasting, something that would endure long after they were gone in the children and grandchildren who carried their legacy forward. As darkness fell over the mountains and the stars began to appear in the clearing sky, Kieran helped Nora to her feet, and they went inside their cabin together, hand in hand, ready to face whatever tomorrow might bring. Because they knew with absolute certainty that they would face it together, just as they had faced every storm that had come their way. And that knowledge, that love, that unbreakable bond between them was the greatest gift either of them had ever received.